Hello and welcome to session 119, How Science Reinforces Liberal Democracy Through a More Realistic Picture of Human Nature. This session is part of the 2021 special track number 3, which is specifically looking at arguments, algorithms and tools, and what do we need in order to shape policy and confront misinformation post COVID-19 pandemic. I'm delighted that you could join me today. My name is Laura Smillie. I work at the European Commission, where I head up its Enlightenment 2.0 multi-annual research programme. So what is Enlightenment 2.0? You may be asking yourselves, and how does that fit in together with the theme of the day? Well, we believe that evidence-informed policymaking makes for better policies. And so in order to understand this, we need to take a human approach to understanding political decision making. So we started this multi-annual research program back in 2018, where we have been working with over 60 experts from around the world, from a myriad of different areas, to look at the various aspects that actually help us understand our very own political nature. This was followed up by a report specifically looking at technology and democracy, looking, amongst other things, in great detail at myth and disinformation. And we're currently in the process of looking at the science of values and identities in the political process. And I'll come back to the future plans we have for meaningful and ethical communications a little bit later at the end of today's presentation. But I'm actually going to take you back to the work that we did in 2019. And you might be asking why. Well, this is actually the crux of what we were looking at in terms of our research. And it was based on thousands of articles with 8 reviews, 1 report, with the input from 60 experts, as I mentioned, from all over the world, in order to distill those priorities and those areas that we have to be focusing on in 21st century political decision making. But then, of course, Corona came along. This report came out in July 2019, where, amongst other things, we were talking about the importance of evidence-informed policymaking. And then there was the pandemic. And suddenly the very nature and the relationship with science changed. Everything turned around on its head. So we started to ask ourselves, and we did a review of, do the results of what we found, do they still stand? Now, very importantly, as part of this review, because it was a work of collective intelligence from so many different diverse areas and disciplines of science, we were able to realize and synthesize these insights to the extent that we realized, yes, they still hold true. It's extraordinarily important. And in fact, rather than changing any of the conclusions or adapting them to be more Corona or COVID-19 friendly. In fact, we said we need to be strengthening this. And in fact, we need to be making these findings more available to larger audiences. And so we actually started initially with translation of this work into Italian, Spanish, French, and German. And so today I'm just going to explain to you a little bit about these really important 7 key areas, these key conclusions that we found from all of these thousands of articles and these different experts about what we really need to be doing in order to be advancing not only pre-pandemic, but also post-pandemic, and where there needs to be certain focuses of attention. So first and foremost, I'm going to start off with misperceptions and disinformation. So here we concluded in this significant piece of research that our thinking skills are challenged by today's information environment, and they make us vulnerable to disinformation. And so really, at the heart of it all, we need to think more about how we think. Here you can see, the crowd comparison between the two photographs of the Trump inauguration on the left-hand side and the Obama inauguration on the right-hand side. And this basically back in the day led to the controversy and the birth of the term of alternative facts. And so really what we're seeing is that the concepts of motivated reasoning are making people resist evidence that is running against their beliefs. When people were asked, in which picture, are there more people? Certain, political people with politically strong motivations to the right were saying, actually, it was at the Trump um, inauguration rather than at the Democrat inauguration. And on top of that, we are seeing from the literature, and this is a really important thing we need to realize, that misinformed people do not think of themselves in any way as ignorant because they hold facts which they believe to be true. And we mustn't lose sight of this. Importantly, we recognized and we discovered that false news, particularly political, it is diffused significantly farther and faster and deeper and more broadly than the truth. And we also saw from what we were looking at and synthesizing in our work is that corrections do not lead to more accurate assessments of the facts, although they do lead to more accurate assessments of the facts, but they generally are not changing people's views, and importantly, they don't change their behaviors either. So this altogether, really, this section on misperceptions and disinformation and this desperate need to think about how we're thinking is really a critical first piece of this important puzzle. The second is looking to collective intelligence, where we're seeing that science can actually help us to redesign the way that policymakers work together to take better decisions and prevent policy mistakes. Here's a nice example of some colleagues who are playing a serious game in something that we have established in the European Commission called the EU Policy Lab. And so what we're looking at is that this capacity, this thinking collectively can actually significantly improve the quality of political decisions, but only if the collaborative processes are carefully designed. And it is only if all the critical information and the unique knowledge and expertise are openly shared can collective intelligence actually be achieved, and groupthink or polarization can actually be avoided. What we also learned is that psychological safety is essential for the sharing of such critical information, ideas, questions, which also enables for dissenting opinions to be able to freely out themselves, and conversations can be much more constructive. The third pillar in all of this is the role of emotions. And importantly, we saw from the literature that very simply, we cannot separate emotion from reason. Better information about citizens' emotions and greater emotional literacy could also improve policymaking. Here we see Jacinda Ardern with her head covered following the very tragic terrorist attack at the Kilbirnie Mosque in March 2019. And we also saw from the literature that emotions are just as essential to decision making as logical reasoning, and as likely to enhance rationality as to subvert it. And that's very counterintuitive to what many people would assume when it comes to objective decision making, and something that we really need to get our heads around and understand better. We also need to understand this very specific nature of particular emotions. For example, angry people are less likely to seek information and are more likely to adopt a closed mind, while people who are more anxious, they are actually seeking information, and that can lead to deeper processing of information. So obviously, the more we understand these things, the more we can help people, but also equally, these emotions can actually be manipulated. So sensing citizens' emotions more effectively could help better guide different policy choices. And learning to integrate and use emotions rather than trying to suppress them could actually improve decision making and certainly collaboration in government. The fourth pillar that we identified as being key for policymaking in the 21st century is really looking at values. Values and also identities, because they drive political behavior but are not properly understood or debated. And we know, and we saw from the literature, that political decisions are strongly influenced by group identity, values, worldviews, and ideologies, as well as personality traits. And that political polarization is on the rise. And a new form of cultural rather than economic polarization has emerged. And certainly within Europe, we're seeing that the far right, for example, is more opposed to immigration and multiculturalism. And so that's just one example. We're seeing values strongly influence not only political behavior, but also perceptions about the facts. Your facts are not my facts. You have a different ideology to me, and so I do not share the same facts that you do. This is a significant evolution in terms of shared understanding and something that we need to be getting our heads around, because this again is looping back to the sources of mis and disinformation at societal levels. The fifth pillar is looking at framing, metaphor, and narrative. Where clearly we saw that the facts very simply don't speak for themselves. Framing metaphors and narratives need to be used responsibly if evidence is to be heard and understood. I particularly like the visuals on this slide. It's actually the official photographs following the G7 meeting in 2018. Clockwise from the top, we've got Germany, Italy, Canada, and France. And you can see very clearly exactly the same meeting, the same situation, and yet have all of the official photographers tried to get their own leader seen to be in the limelight. And it speaks to the whole concept of framing. There's no such thing as a neutral frame. Something is included at the expense of something else. Something, in other words, is left out. The ways in which policy problems are framed can substantially influence beliefs. And then really importantly to understand is it's not the side with the most or the best facts that wins an argument, but the one that provides the most plausible scenario that feels intuitively reliable and communicated by a perceived credible source. That's the side that's going to be winning the argument. So this needs to be taken into consideration as well, which naturally leads us on to the need for trust and openness. So the erosion of trust in experts and in government can only be addressed by greater honesty and public deliberation about interests and values. Here you see an image, in fact, of Leo Varadkar, who was the equivalent of the Prime Minister in Ireland following the result of a referendum on liberalising abortion law. And this followed the result of an intensive year-long dialogue with representative citizen assemblies. This idea of citizen involvement kind of really goes to the heart of openness and transparency, because trustworthiness depends on not only expertise, but honesty and shared interests and values, which means that for someone to be perceived as being trustworthy, all of these things need to be met and not simply excellence in expertise. And that brings us on to the next point, which is one on the ideal of value-free science. In reality, it's a lot more complex than this because values can enter the scientific process at many different stages. And this doesn't mean that science cannot be trusted, not at all. But there's a need to be more transparent about the roles of values in science. So opening evidence to public scrutiny is crucial to maintaining the necessary scientific authority. And deliberative democracy and citizen engagement can be incredibly effective responses to the loss of trust in democratic institutions more broadly. And this brings us to the seventh and final cornerstone, if you like, from our findings, which is about the importance of evidence-informed policymaking. Very simply, the principle that policy should be informed by evidence is under serious attack. Politicians, scientists, and civil society need to defend this cornerstone of liberal democracy. The framing of a policy problem, it's a political rather than a technical issue that determines what research is needed and what evidence counts and what should be ignored. So what's in or what's out. And really importantly, in current times, the commitment to evidence-informed policy can no longer be taken for granted. What we're seeing is that partisan leadership in highly polarized political environments can undermine the capacity of governments to use evidence effectively. And we saw from the literature that there are extensive barriers to the use of evidence. And also in practice, scientists and policy makers, very simply, they have different norms, cultures, languages, misaligned incentives, understanding of time and budget and constraints. So there's a real need for well-designed, evidence-informed policy systems that can include knowledge brokers, boundary organizations, and links between scientists and policymakers. So the principle of informing policy through evidence could be recognized, in fact, potentially as a key accompaniment to the principles of democracy and the rule of law. So what does this mean? Well, in short, it means we need a new model for political decision making, something that enables a human-centric approach that actually speaks to our human foibles, because we're not neutral and we're not objective. But if we listen and consider all these mental and physical signals, in fact, the outcomes would be far more effective, efficient, and much more meaningful. And talking of meaningful, this brings us to the next area of research that we're going to be concentrating on. So coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to be launching the next international call for experts, because we're wanting to look at meaningful and ethical communications, conducting a state-of-the-art review of the science, looking to engage with the public in order to be able to provide advice to public institutions in the form of practical tools. When we sum everything up together, we're wanting to understand what is both meaningful from an institutional communications perspective. How can we speak from an ivory tower to the people on the street in a way that resonates with them, but without perhaps exploiting some potential audience targeting methodologies? So how can we ensure at the same time that messages resonate, but that they are ethical and widely accepted? So that's what we're wanting to look at next. Where does persuasion start and manipulation stop? Or persuasion stop and manipulation start? These are the things we're going to be looking at, and it should be a very exciting new project. So that's what we're up to next. So if you'd like to get in touch, you see that I'm on Twitter, as is the JRC. You can follow us there. And I very much look forward to hearing all of your questions during the last panel session of the conference. And I look forward to explaining a bit more about this work and how it's extremely relevant to the post-COVID world that we find ourselves in today. Thank you very much.